Hey everybody, welcome again. I'm Jesse Lee, the Online Program Director at the White House. I'm here with Austin Goolsbee. He's with the Council of Economic Advisors. I hope you had a chance to watch the President's speech just now on his economic agenda, his economic vision, and frankly the choice that the country has on how to move forward on the economy. We've been taking some questions on Facebook for a while throughout the morning. I've got kind of a stockpile here. Took some of your best shots. But we want to hear your questions now in the chat. If you're watching on whitehouse.gov, we invite you to follow the links over to Facebook, where you can drop in your questions for Mr. Goolsbee. And we'll go ahead and get started. For those who missed the President's speech, maybe you can give kind of the real quick version of what he was talking about.
Okay, I'll give the summary version. There's a theme and some new policies that he announced. The theme is really one that dates back to the campaign for all the last couple of years of the administration, in which the president outlines his vision that we've got to reestablish broad-based economic growth that benefits the middle class if we are to have a sustainable economic recovery in this country. That we were in a ditch when the president came in. We have begun to turn that around, but it was a very deep hole. And the way we're going to do that is by investing in our workers, having our businesses invest in factories and equipment, investing in research, training our people, that ultimately that's the long-run strategy we need to embody. And the new policy that he's outlined, you saw earlier this week, the president outlined a policy of infrastructure investment, forming an infrastructure bank that we would rebuild roads, bridges, runways as a way to both catalyze economic growth and to make investments for the future. And today the president's calling for making permanent, larger, and more simplified the research and development tax credit for businesses, and allowing all businesses in America that build factories or buy equipment here to expense that from their tax returns. So they would be things that will be quite beneficial to small business, to encouraging building of factories and the kinds of things that will create jobs. They follow up, the president has been for tailored jobs programs for all of the past year, and these follow up in that kind of a frame.
All right. I wanted to go ahead and start with kind of a broad question. It's something that there was a huge thread about it on Facebook earlier. It's come up a couple times in the chat while we've been waiting to get started here. And there's been kind of a big debate of going back to FDR and the Great Depression and kind of talking about, what can we learn from that time? Did what FDR did work? To what extent are those times kind of informing what the president is doing now? So maybe you can talk a little bit
Look,
about
I like this historical line of thinking. I think it's interesting to make comparisons between what we've faced over the last 2 to 3 years and what they faced in 1929 and throughout the 1930s with the Depression. There are a few similarities. I think as the president took office, the financial crisis that had begun put us right on the edge of another Great Depression, that if we had not taken the actions we did, and if the Fed had not also taken the actions that it took, it actually could have been worse than the Great Depression. The financial crisis that occurred, both the stock market and credit markets and the housing market, were by many measures worse than the one in 1929. And the downturn in the economy was the worst since 1929. So we really we were in free fall, and were it not for the Recovery Act and the other actions taken by the administration, I think we could have faced a very terrible circumstance. Now, as to whether the New Deal or World War II or monetary policy or what were the things that got us out of the 1930s depression, I think historians still argue about some of those. But there are a couple distinct periods which I do think are lessons for today, one of which being 1937, where they start on the path to recovery. They have fairly robust recovery, and everybody throws in the towel too early and say, well, now's the time to tighten the belt and massively downsize the the kind of intervention that we're doing, and they go back into a second deep recession, the original double dip, as it were. And so I think we want to make sure that we're out of the woods before anybody starts talking about really pulling back. I think one thing that is different now than was then is that the efforts of the administration from the beginning have been about, let's try to find a way to stand up the private sector. The government came in because the private sector was in free fall and had stopped spending completely. The government is trying to get the engine started and let the car drive on its own. And so you see in the president's speech today where we're outlining things like expanding the research and development tax credit for people to do research and develop here in the United States, expanding the incentives for business investment so they build factories here in the United States. These are things that are not direct government jobs. They're the government using incentives to try to get the private sector stood up.
Okay, to take a couple from the chat, there's been two that have been bleeding over. One has been asking about the 99ers, people that have been unemployed for a long time, have been exhausting
Yes.
their benefits. Unemployment benefits was certainly a big kind of legislative fight not too long ago. And people have been kind of linking that also to foreclosures and the kind of ongoing problem there. So maybe you can touch on both of those.
Okay, well, I'll say, look, the 99ers are people that have been employed 99 weeks. That's a long time to be unemployed, pushing 2 years. But and that is a critical problem. And when the unemployment rate is 9.6%, that's not the only problem. Unemployment in the job market, we have a long way to go. We are in the deepest hole since the Depression, and it takes us a while to get out of that. Now, on the good side, we've had positive private sector job growth for 8 straight months after a recession that began in 2007. So we clearly are on the right path, but we must do more and we must speed that up. And that's why the president's for these targeted policies. On the long-term unemployed, the president has been very concerned about that. It's why we pushed the HIRE Act, which gives specific incentives for small businesses and others to hire the long-term unemployed. In the last jobs report, you may have seen the unemployment durations actually fell. So that was encouraging. And you have seen widespread sympathy in both parties, and certainly pushed by the administration, that we've got to be aware that when you're in the worst recession in our lifetimes, that we shouldn't be so quick to cut off the unemployment insurance for people who are unable to find jobs. I mean, it's clear that the reason most people are not able to find jobs is not through some great fault of their own. It's because the economy's in a bad spot.
Okay, one of the things you talked about in your opening remarks, one of the things the president's talked about for a few days now has been this investment in America's infrastructure. So I'll take a couple questions we got earlier on that. B was on the positive side. She said America needs to catch up with the rest of the world on infrastructure. It's important to improve the infrastructure in this country if we're going to compete with countries like China. Sharon Binning, on the other hand, said all this infrastructure will not be jobs created for receptionists, bank tellers, bookkeepers, techies, office personnel, et cetera. And on, kind of a third route, Tom Clements said, do you think $50 billion is enough? Can we create an infrastructure bank budget to where the money is constantly flowing?
Okay, all of those are good questions. The infrastructure, I think B's point is quite an important one. If you look at a lot of other countries in the world that are aspiring to grow, they are engaged in building airports, in building out ports, in repaving and modernizing their highway system in a way to try to attract investment to their country. We can't let that go by the wayside in a crisis. So I think there is a bit of a win-win that is possible here, which is it can help us come out of the downturn, and it will be the kind of investment that will be needed to put us on a growth path. To the charge that, well, those are only construction jobs and not receptionist jobs and techie jobs, et cetera, I would say a few things. One, the president hasn't just proposed that. He has proposed over the last year a series of targeted jobs type measures. Even in the announcement today, you see the research and development tax credit, which if looked at on its own, somebody might say, well, great, that's a lot of, that creates jobs for research and development people, but what about construction workers? Well, that's where the infrastructure fits in. You look at the small business bill that the president has been pressing, that Republicans have tied up in Congress, but that absolutely should and must be passed. That's going to gear toward the entire small business sector across every industry and every occupation type. And likewise, the president's trying to give these tax incentives for building factories or buying equipment in the U.S. that he outlined today. That's also going to apply to anybody. If you're a receptionist at a company that's buying computers, they're going to qualify for this expensing, just as if you're working at a construction firm that's buying construction equipment. So I think we should be mindful of all of those sectors, but we shouldn't look at any one policy in isolation.
Okay. Yeah, this is going to be a bit of a softball just because I know it's something that we're working on, but Brad Robb says we should offer small business loans to Americans. So maybe just flesh that out a little bit.
Look, the way I'll flesh that out is the president has a really important small business bill that is sitting and waiting in Congress. It's being held up by some Republican opposition. There are even Republicans supporting that bill, which would free up credit for small businesses, which has been a critical problem in this financial crisis, that small businesses can't get access to money at their banks, which are trying to tighten the lending in every dimension. It would give multiple kinds of direct tax relief to small business owners, from capital gains relief for people starting their own business to a variety of things in healthcare and in some others. We must pass that bill. Normally, small business is one of the engines pulling you out of a recession. In this one, they continue to be a drag on the economy because there's not credit to facilitate them getting the engine started. So I agree with the sentiment completely.
Okay, and Steve Alexander was asking kind of how would the president's stance on extending the tax cuts for the middle class, but letting them expire, I should say, for the richest Americans. How does that fit into his kind of economic vision?
Okay, look, I think it fits into the vision quite specifically. One, there is no greater source of certainty that we can provide to the economy right now than to make the tax cuts permanent for the 98% of people who make less than $250,000 a year. He believes that it has been an extremely squeezing period of time, the last 15 years, on the middle class in this country, and especially the last 8, where we went through a boom, which was the first boom in recorded U.S. economic history, where the median family, right in the middle, saw their income fall by $2,000 over the course of a boom. And that was before we went into the crisis. Then the economic crisis comes, wiping out the savings of millions of Americans, throwing millions of people out of work, and now is the time to provide relief and certainty to that group. On the issue of, well, what about for the top 2% of people who make more than $250,000 a year? The country cannot afford $750 billion more tax cuts for that group. And every independent body that has looked at tax cuts for the very wealthy has observed that they are the least bang for the buck that you can get in terms of trying to get the economy going. So I don't think on efficiency grounds or on fairness grounds that it makes sense to do that, or on fiscal responsibility grounds. So the president's made quite clear he's not for that.
This is another thing I think it's probably good to get the word out on. Deborah Strickland asked in the chat, is it possible to tax companies that outsource American jobs and give incentives to companies that hire full-time workers here in America?
Well, look, the president has, for many years when he was in the Senate, since he's been in the administration, tried to identify tax breaks for companies that ship jobs overseas and tried to take away the imbalance that it encourages companies to do that. And he wants to use that money to encourage hiring and investment and activity in the U.S. You see part of that today, where we're outlining clear tax incentives to build factories in the U.S., to do research and development in the U.S. In the HIRE Act, which I described before, which passed, the president put in place direct tax incentives that would reward companies for hiring the long-term unemployed or for expanding their employment. And I think we ought to keep pressing on all of these different ways because, as Deborah raises, there are two sides to this. One, we want to have a level playing field for American companies that are competing abroad. We don't want something that tilts the playing field, encouraging them to move factories to other places. And we want to encourage the kinds of investment in job creation here at home that really make for long-standing careers for our kids, for ourselves, where people are getting the kind of training they need to make a good, decent living over the coming decades. That's what we've had in the U.S. in the past, and we've got to maintain that, or else, you know, that's not where we want to be. Let's put it that way.
Right. And yeah, if you go to whitehouse.gov, you'll and you kind of go to the search box and search "Made in America," you'll find that's a theme that the president's kind of hit on hard in a lot of his recent speeches. And I also just, you'll see that we dropped a link to more information on the HIRE Act into the chat. And one thing I meant to say earlier also is as far as those asking about foreclosures, if you go to HUD.gov, HUD.gov, you'll see that they're heavily dedicated towards directing people to where they need to go for help. This is a question that always comes up, and I always like to ask it to you. Lorraine Little Vasilo asked, when will the president abandon his socialist agenda and embrace American values, free enterprise, and capitalism?
Well, I think you're being a little tough on us, Lorraine. Look, the president, as he outlines in the speech, it's not anti-market to be for regulatory oversight. He's strongly pro-market, and if you look at the policies that we're outlining, look at the policies today. These are policies which are not about the government taking over things. They are about trying to stand up private industry to get the economy growing again. So they are tax incentives for private companies to do research and development, tax incentives for private companies to build factories and buy equipment. There's nothing socialist, anti-market about that. These are ideas that we ought to have considerable common ground on, that Republicans and Democrats ought to be able to unite on and do them quickly, because everybody knows that we have started in a deep hole, and we faced further bumps this summer coming from Europe, the threats that pose to confidence in the U.S. and around the world. And we're having to deal with a series of almost unprecedented problems that we haven't had to face, that developed countries have not had to face in decades and decades. And the only way in the long run that we can do that is to stand up the private sector. But let's not forget history. At the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, the private sector was in free fall. We were in collapse. Business investment had ground completely to a halt. The housing market was collapsing. Personal consumption was collapsing. Our 401k values were collapsing, and we had to act to stop that. Now, we did it. We ended the free fall. Now we must continue the struggle to get out of this hole, to get us on a sustainable growth path. There's nothing socialist about that.
All right. I know you got a deadline coming up, so I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay, lightning round. Here we go.
Right. Jose Serrano says, what about the people who are making nothing at all? I'm not going to take an $8 job for something I was getting paid $25 for. I guess the question I'd kind of extrapolate from that is, can you speak a little bit to the kind of the middle class struggling in general, not just kind of those unemployed,
Look,
but those
they
having
have.
to take a little less.
It's a good reminder that the squeeze on the middle class predated this crisis. It was in full swing over the last 8 years, where the middle class's income was falling despite the overall economy and corporate profits doing very well. And now you add on top of that squeeze the double squeeze associated with the worst downturn since the Depression. We ought to be concerned about job creation and incomes of the American people who are in jobs, which have also been strained, and people who got moved to part-time employment when they wanted to be working full-time, and people who dropped out of the labor force who really wish they could be there in a job, but they got discouraged. All of those things mean the job market's condition is worse than even the basic numbers convey. That is what happens when you're in an economic downturn of this magnitude. And the president comes to work every day, and we're going to hammer at that wall with targeted jobs policies, with everything we can do to get us back on the path. 8 straight months of private sector job creation is a good start, but we've got a very long way to go. And it's about creating jobs, and it's about rebuilding the incomes and the retirement safety net for all the American people. I mean, we're all in this thing together.
All right, well, for those who missed it or coming in late, we'll have video of this whole chat up later, along with the president's full speech. Thanks a lot, Austin. Thanks a lot, everybody, for participating.
Thanks for your time.